This is the Ohio Adult Allies Podcast. Welcome. Here, our mission is to develop, inspire, and empower youth leaders. Our topic for today is social and structural determinants of adolescent health and advocacy, with special guest Rosemary Ketchum. Now here's our host, Christine McGill.
Hello, welcome to the Ohio Adult Alliance podcast series. I am Christine McGill, project manager at Ohio University. And in this capacity, I work to advance the efforts of the Ohio Adult Allies Initiative, supporting Ohio Adult Allies to empower you in creating social change. And we have Rosemary Ketchum here today. Rosemary, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hey, Christine. Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. Yes, my name is Rosemary Ketchum. I'm a member of the Wheeling City Council here in West Virginia. And I've worked in social justice and community organizing for many years, particularly prior to running for local office, focused on issues like healthcare, race, LGBTQ issues, affordable housing, public transit, and so love the opportunity and ability to not just talk about the work that I love, but also talk about what impact leadership has on your mental health and on community building more broadly. So thank you so much for having me. Excited to chat.
Thank you and welcome. The Ohio Adult Allies, we really aspire to foster opportunities for all individuals to engage in social action. And our focus today is going to be really centered around the systems and other social factors that may cause marginalization for youth. So, Rosemary, when we were looking into your background, you have an educational background in psychology, right? And your professional and personal experiences navigating governing bodies. I think with that, you have a real potential to provide a new lens for us. So, with the advancement of technology and communications, it feels like we're more likely to witness injustice or inequities. But likewise, we also are exposed to countless individuals who are taking social action and are working hard toward advocacy or reform. So today, we want to look at both sides of those coin. First, I would like to focus on that macro level. What are some examples of ways that young people may have been affected by policy, laws, government, either historically or currently? And how might those relate to structural or social determinants of adolescent health?
That's a great question. And there's so many answers to that question, and I'll answer from my own personal experience and my perspective in the work. I found through so many years of community organizing that one of the most underrepresented and frankly patronized to groups are kids, are young people. We don't take young people seriously. We don't give them opportunities to lead or to give advice. We assume that until you're 18, you don't care, you're not impacted, it doesn't matter, whatever, or you don't have a perspective or a lived experience that's valuable. And I felt that when I was a kid and when I was a teenager wanting to get involved in this work. And I see it all the time when we, as leaders, as elected officials, as community organizers, when we talk about the issues, we usually forget an enormous part of the population, which is our youth population. And so I found in the past couple years, particularly since school boards and curriculum has been under attack across the nation, kids are really taking a front seat in regards to community organizing in their neighborhoods. And that is not just happening in places like San Francisco and Brooklyn. It is happening in places like West Virginia, some of the most rural communities in our state. And I think it's partly out of desperation, right? When people don't give you power or privilege, you've got to take it. And I think we're seeing that happen slowly but surely with kids. And older folks might get very mixed up or confused or frustrated about future generations. I feel very good about Gen Z and Gen Alpha and not only their ability to see a problem well and interpret it, but more than anything, be painfully honest about what the solution looks like. And that's not something that I think we see very often. So I'm seeing more than ever kids really take control of the work that's happening, both whether that's in their school boards. Here in the city of Wheeling, we passed a youth city council model so that kids could actually lean in and let us know how the work should be done as members of city council. So I feel very optimistic, but we have a long road to go.
I love that idea of taking back power and the fact that, and you hit on this very quickly, is that historically we've seen young people as, just set to the side. And somewhere along the way, we forget to incorporate them. So Adult Allies is really all about just providing that space for young people to engage in a meaningful way. So why is it important for those who are working with youth to understand local, state, or federal government when we're talking specifically about youth-led prevention?
I think it's incredibly important that we are focusing on how things impact children because, unfortunately, by and large, people under 18 do not have systemic or institutional power to advocate for themselves. They can organize, they can protest, they can do these things, but they usually don't hold positions of power. And typically, it will be adults making those decisions for people under 18. And we're seeing that really closely, and I think really vulnerably right here in the state of West Virginia when it comes to access to healthcare, particularly trans-affirming healthcare, gender-affirming healthcare for people under 18. When lawmakers were creating these policies, they weren't talking to kids. They weren't talking to trans youth. They weren't talking to Gen Z or Gen Alpha. Because if they were to talk to kids under 18, that policy obviously would not have been written and passed because I think kids understand the value of diversity. They understand the importance of access to healthcare. And they understand that as an American, freedom doesn't look like reducing access to a resource. That's not what freedom looks like. And so, again, I think that's where my optimism comes from when I talk to kids. I had an intern for city council named Ella, love Ella, here in the city of Wheeling, and she was 14 when she interned with me. And I could not hope for a better group of people to lead this country, frankly, particularly when it comes to mental health. They're very focused on that. But as adults working in policy, as adults who are shaping these policies, it's not enough to care about how it impacts kids. It matters that we are engaging them and asking them serious questions and frankly, giving them a seat at the table. I'll say one of the most formative leadership experiences. I was not a kid. I was in my early 20s, but it was when I was in college that our college allowed a student representative to sit on the board. And there were kids under 18 who had some formal leadership positions as well. And that, I think, cannot be underestimated, that experience, giving kids leadership opportunity as young as possible, frankly, because we've got to set them up to defend themselves, unfortunately, when it comes to policy.
And I think that just led us straight into this idea of what are some of those strategies that can address, social and structural determinants of adolescent health with maybe a specific focus on policy or government and looking at how to reduce inequities for different populations of young people.
We know in local government, in kind of urbanism, in urban development, that environments change behaviors. And when we're able to create holistic community environments that support the mental, physical, and emotional well-being of all people in our communities, then we're doing something right. And that is a much longer conversation than we're going to have today. But it's really important that we're talking about how we design streets and where we put buildings and where folks can go to the grocery stores and how walkable a neighborhood is. It might not seem that like it has serious implications to a person's mental health and lived experience, but it does. And particularly when it comes to kids, I found it funny. I'll talk to a lot of older folks and they'll kind of rag on kids and they'll say like, they never go outside. They're not playing in the yard. Kids are so whatever these days. And I'm like, would you like to play in a concrete jungle? If we're not building cities that are built for kids, kids are not going to enjoy those communities. there's a perspective there that I think is missing, and that is of kids. And so I think when it comes to building urban environments, we have to make sure that they're fit for everybody. When it comes to policy making, again, I do think that we need to pull kids at the table. It's one of the reasons that I work to pass the youth city council, is so that we're not having conversations about them without them. And frankly, right now, we're talking about splash pads in the city of Wheeling, hundreds of thousands of dollars dedicated to building splash pads. Kids love them, but they weren't involved necessarily in the idea making process. And I think that was a missed opportunity. And so I think those are two opportunities there. And then I'm not a parent myself, and so I can't really give this advice from lived experience, but I do believe from my nieces and nephews that we need to ask kids complicated questions because they can give really complex, thoughtful answers. We, again, patronize and condescend to kids, to people under 18, because we just don't think they know enough. There's a Taylor Swift song, I'm a Swiftie, and there's a Taylor Swift song, Cardigan, that says, when you are young, people assume you know nothing. And I think it's a great kind of descriptor or illustration of the way that we address or approach or think about people under 18. We don't think they know anything. And I found more often than not, they know more, not only more than we think they do, but more than we think we do.
Thank you for that. And I love that you said nothing about us without us. That is
Yeah.
one of the biggest mottos I think that Ohio Allies kind of strives to work toward. Um, and you got me thinking about when we're talking about policies or environments, thinking about systems and the interactions with culture. So how do you think we can switch or start to switch that mentality or that paradigm of thinking that young people have nothing to contribute?
So, as I'm sure you've seen, there's so much research that shows us that, having one supportive adult in your life as a kid is enough to really set the course of your life. And, I will talk to folks in our high schools. I'll occasionally go and speak at the middle school or the high school. And, kids will come up to me afterward and talk about, their just lived experiences as queer kids or as young people in leadership. Um, and I'll ask a follow-up question about like what makes you feel empowered, or who gave you that permission to feel empowered, knowing that's kind of a trick answer. Because they almost always say nobody gave me permission. I had to do it myself. But occasionally, kids who feel, I think, the most impacted or the most empowered will talk about a single adult, whether that is a school counselor or an advisor or somebody in their life, particularly in their school system, that is actively setting them up for success. And a couple, I think, examples of that, there's a school locally that has tried really hard to start their own GSA, their Gay Straight Alliance. I think they call it something different now. I feel old calling it a GSA. But they were like, I don't know how to start this. And I'm just a kid. And, they asked for advice, and I said, find an administrator or an ally in your school. And they did. And they found somebody really, really good and thoughtful who would kind of be their institutional leverage or, access. And they were able to start their own alliance group at their school. And it was just one adult that, didn't necessarily give them permission, but gave them a roadmap for what that looked like. And I think that's ultimately what allyship looks like. Not handing people something, but giving them not only the confidence to know that they can do it on their own, but using your privilege to give access, and to maybe even thwart the status quo in many ways. I've found that to be very successful.
You have my brain going in so many different directions. We're talking about, these young people and specifically thinking about those young people who you mentioned who had to empower themselves, right?
Mhm, mhm.
It's hard to imagine the young people who are out there and they feel like they don't have anyone in their corner, right?
Yeah.
So, can you speak more on how we can actually involve those young people in social action who are specifically, disenfranchised or don't feel empowered by the people
Mhm.
within their communities?
That's a really good question. I think, sometimes we'll fall into toxic positivity where we kind of say, oh, there's always somebody out there who can help you or support you. And frankly, the older I get, the more I realize that that is sometimes just not the case. For queer kids who live in really kind of desolate environments that don't feel supportive, sometimes there isn't one single supportive adult in their universe or in their environment. And so it's one of the kind of double-edged experiences of the internet. I think that the internet is obviously a tool that can be used for good and used for evil. And I found, particularly for community building and community organizing, the internet has been an indispensable tool for doing that work for both, adults, obviously, but for kids to connect with each other. There's this incredible community organizing group out of Georgia that's done a lot of ballot measure work and a lot of work in the school board system. And they started out as people under 18, as kids, realizing that they didn't feel represented and that their values weren't reflected from their school board. And, rather than looking around for necessarily a supportive adult, they looked around at each other and they said, hey, if we support each other, that might be all that we need. And it's been incredibly successful and they're doing a great job. And they were able to connect primarily online. They were in different school districts. They weren't in the same high school, many of them, but they were able to kind of coalesce on the internet. And I think, we've definitely had a kind of Zoom fatigue and internet fatigue over the pandemic. And I think that has kind of impacted a lot of the community organizing that we would otherwise have. But I do believe that that is how kids are able to connect with each other and feel a sense of support and a sense of camaraderie when they don't have that at home. And the other thing I'll say is that, I've grown myself in my perspectives about what it means to do the work and to kind of stick it out. And when I started my community organizing journey and I talked to people who were like, man, I really want to do good things, but I don't think it's possible here, or I don't feel good in where I live. And I would say, kind of toxically, I'd say like, "Oh, I understand, but you've gotta stick it out, and sometimes we've gotta make sacrifices for the work, and we've gotta organize." And now I realize, particularly that our politics seem so almost dystopian and dire, I don't ask people to stay. I don't ask people to surrender their happiness, whether they're under 18 or over 40, just because the work needs done and they need to kind of change the work. Your happiness and your peace is more valuable than, frankly, the work that we're doing. And so, yeah, if you feel like you're a young person who is really struggling to find community in your hometown, maybe you need to find a new hometown. And that's really hard. That's really hard to say. But I do think that it's important advice because otherwise you can feel almost paralyzed by your environment.
I'm hearing a couple different things. First, it's about education, somewhat. Second is connection, but also I love that idea of creating your own community because yes, it is it's tough to at some point, cut ties and say, this isn't going to be beneficial for me or help me thrive.
Right.
So I'm going to find another community and build it and then find my path within. So expanding from that, when we're talking about adult allyship or community organization, we know that data is really valuable when we're talking about addressing social issues.
Mhm.
Do you see any type of research gaps in our understanding with structural or social determinants of adolescent health and different groups of young people who may be marginalized? And if so, what can we do to address those research gaps?
Yes, I imagine there are many gaps in research and understanding of what um, this generation of young people are experiencing related to their own social and emotional health. Um, I mean, without talking out of school, I'm not a research scientist necessarily, but we are, I think, actively engaging kids across the state of West Virginia through various projects. But we were asking really important questions about what they want in the future, what they feel currently about their own environments and their own states. And it's happening in different ways and different forms. We've done some work here in the city of Wheeling around kind of youth engagement. And yet there is always something that we're missing. And I personally, my belief is that the kind of research gap is around the question of what they would like their leadership to look like in the future. Because I imagine, I know that as adults, we imagine what we think kids should be doing or should be leading or should be taking charge of. But we need to be asking them, what does leadership look like for you? Whether that means running for office when you're old enough, whether that means starting, a nonprofit or a community organizing group like the folks in Georgia. Um, because I do think that kids have really good ideas that we are not capturing about what it means to connect with each other and what it means to kind of build community online, but maybe even more importantly, offline in their neighborhoods. I think that is going to be just really important research that happens and probably informs the next 30 years of community organizing work. Because even my experience, I've been working for 12 or 15 years in the kind of the organizing world, and it has changed. It is unrecognizable today than it was 10 years ago. And so I can imagine for young people who are getting into kind of civic work that in the next 10 years, it will be unrecognizable. And we need to be preparing for that. And that's not a great answer. I'm sorry, but that's kind of what's coming to mind right now is what leadership looks like and how we can prepare for that.
I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I loved the concept of what does leadership look like to you, and us not really taking the time necessarily to think about what that future looks like for them, right? And that sparked another thought to me in regards to, allyship and community organization leadership. When we're looking at leadership and the systems, I also think about the importance of like visibility of people who we can connect with. And so, do you have any kind of advice or insight on that concept of youth who maybe are experiencing currently or have historically experienced marginalization due to being part of the BIPOC community or LGBTQIA plus?
You know, it is funny because we feel today, particularly for young folks, I think we have more representation of, BIPOC communities and queer communities than ever before, which is incredible. And yet it is kind of bifurcated in many ways. We've got lots of representation in the media, not a lot of representation in government, not a lot of representation in administration, not a lot of representation on school boards, that kind of thing. And so, kind of back to that, what does leadership look like for you? I imagine, for a lot of kids, when they don't see themselves reflected in positions of civic leadership, they imagine that it's like not built for them or that they have to break into it. And it is not an ideal situation to have to break into something, and nobody wants to be the first. And so, I do think that there's work that we need to do there to build representation. And some folks might think that it's cliche or not necessary or just fluffy. Representation is probably the most important thing that we can do right now. I can't tell you how many experiences that I've had just living my life, doing nothing necessarily spectacular. And folks will reach out to me and say, thank you. My 13-year-old, queer kid has never seen anybody who looks like them or has the same lived experience as them on television or on the local news or passing a policy or doing whatever. And, I take that for granted because I'm just living my life. But I do think that the ramifications of that work is kind of immeasurable. And I know that, we have a very, very low representation of Black people in our state legislature, Black women in particular. I believe we have one Black woman in our state legislature currently. And when Danielle Walker was serving in our West Virginia legislature, so many people of color, people of other vulnerable communities said, thank you. I feel finally that there is a small part of me represented in our state legislature. And so that, I think, inspires people to stay and continue doing the work when they feel that it's possible. But it also helps people see themselves in that kind of leadership. And frankly, I think also when representation is denied, it can have an effect that is just as powerful as it being accepted. For example, I was slated to speak at a local high school and about kind of just civic government, and some less than thoughtful community members heard about this and threatened a riot at the school if I was going to speak. And ultimately, they did not allow me to speak because they were worried about the safety of the students, which is just insane for me to even consider. But shortly after, the students put together a list of dozens and dozens of names of letter of support, and they were like, "We know this doesn't actually make a difference, but we felt we needed to do something to push back on kind of the cancel culture that is existing right now in so many school districts around, you know, just normal conversations about civic government or whatever." And it was a moment. I'm not a crier, but I was like, "Oh my God, these kids get it. These kids are doing the work, even though they know that they don't have that institutional power to make that change. They can be loud and they can be inconvenient for many people." And I think that is so powerful and yummy and makes me really excited for the future.
No, thank you for sharing that story. And I think when we've had these other conversations, just the idea of feeling like we're seeing and we're heard is probably one of the most critical pieces in engaging our young people in social action. So I think you really hit on that. And more so, like we understand with, policy evaluation, reform at any level, we know that that's important. But for someone who may be new at working at a systems level, is there any advice that you would give to making changes at a macro level?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, one thing I haven't said that I think is important to acknowledge is really naming the trauma that these younger generations have experienced. I mean, just the environmental impacts of COVID and a financial crisis and a recession and terrorism and school shootings and just you name it, and a Canadian haze that's over the country right now. I couldn't imagine being a 15-year-old and and climate change and thinking about what my future looks like. I think that has to be part of what system change looks like, is that we can't pretend, we can't use flowery language, we can't condescend to people and make them feel like everything's okay all the time, and if you just work hard enough, it'll be fine. We have to really acknowledge I think, the chaos that we're in right now, uh, while also acknowledging that the work is still important and that you can't give it up because it's really, really tough. At a systems level, I do think that we, as local governments, as institutions, we have bylaws and codes and ordinances that have likely not been updated for decades. And so I think doing a mass audit of your institution's language is really, really important, and making sure that it reflects what your community looks like today. For example, our charter, our city charter, it was last updated in 1992, and which was a year before I was born. Not a flex. It was in 1992, and one of the lines in our Parks and Recreation Commission code says that something to the extent that this commission shall be made of up to 11 members, one of them being a woman. And in 1992, that was probably very progressive. Today, we assume and hope and expect there to be not just one woman on a commission, and like that's meeting quota. And so that's just one example of what it looks like maybe to audit your, books and say, okay, what can we do to actually make this more relevant and more appealing to young people? I think that's one opportunity. I think something that I've been able to kind of grow from is my sense of imposter syndrome, of feeling that, goodness, if I'm not represented, that is probably an indication that I shouldn't be here, or I'm not smart enough, or I don't have the same background, or, whatever. I'm not wealthy enough. I don't have enough network or connection. And it's fascinating. It's not foolproof, but Gen Z and Gen Alpha do not experience that same level of imposter syndrome. They know what they know, and they can see the world being incredibly messy, and they either want nothing to do with it, or they're not willing to take it at face value. And so that gives me, again, a lot of like joy to see. And I think it's something we can learn from folks who are younger than we are. But also when we do feel that young people are experiencing this sense of imposter syndrome, that they're not welcome or they're not involved, I think the surest cure for that is actually just, giving them some kind of authority, whether that is in a kind of school GSA or a student government association or on your board or what have you, is putting your money where your mouth is and making sure that they have decision-making power. I think that, we can say a lot of things. We can say that we want to empower kids, but unless we're giving them a vote, I don't think we're doing that. I don't think we're actually following our own advice. And that's hard to hear. And I've struggled, frankly, in my own institutions with people who say, like, I get it, but do we want to give a 15-year-old the power to, like, deny a huge program because they were the deciding vote? And I was like, pull up. Yeah. If this is going to impact them, I definitely think that they should have a seat at the table. And many folks in my own life have grown and understand that to be, important, but it is not easy. It's a kind of a culture shock for a lot of folks.
I never would have anticipated the idea of the systems change also being about just acknowledging the trauma and the issues that our community members are facing. That's not necessarily the first thing that I would have thought of, but I feel like it is so significant and really profound to just give pause and acknowledge where people have been, where they are now, and then say, what can we do to support you within that process so that we can actually make change instead of sweeping it under the rug or saying that someone's got it all in their head, right?
Yeah.
So thank you for that. Is there anything else you want to add?
Oh, goodness. I don't think so. I think we
Okay.
covered it.
All right. Well, that concludes our conversation for today. Rosemary, thank you so much for your insights on making change at a broader systems level, as well as your work within our communities. It's amazing. And I'm Christine McGill on behalf of the Ohio.Allies. We hope that you enjoyed today's conversation and were able to draw some valuable pieces. For more conversations, feel free to check out our website, the Ohio.Allies. And as always, embrace, embolden, and empower whenever possible. Thank you.
We would like to say thank you to our special guests. For more information about their organizations, feel free to use the information on the screen or below in the description. Thank you to our listeners. This has been the Ohio Adult Allies Podcast. For more episodes, you can find us on Spotify, iTunes, Google Play, YouTube, and more. You can also find our episodes and more information about us on our website, ohioadultallies.com. And again, thank you.